forward to him coming back. We've had apologies from councillors Mark Aldred and Barry Warner. Any others that we know of?
James Lundy.
Oh, I'm not giving his apologies because he hasn't given them to me.
Well, that's okay.
I don't give apologies if they don't.
Fine.
Andrew,
Okay.
Shah was here from Rochdale.
Shaw was here from Rochdale. Okay, thank you very much. So, Chair's announcements and urgent business. There isn't any urgent business as such. Just to say that at the end of the formal part of the proceedings, we will be having a private session to have presentations on, first of all, an update on CAM's first 6 months operating the Metrolink contract. And we're also going to have a brief update on the rail investment programme, particularly in the light of yesterday's announcements on the Northwest electrification. So those are in private session at the end of the meeting. So 3 declarations of interest. Has anybody got a need to declare anything? No? 4 minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of November. Yes.
Found the right button. Thank you, Chair. On page 11, under the services update, it says a report would be provided to the next committee in January 18 about the conclusion of Network Rail's assessment and proposals for May 18. It isn't on this morning's agenda, and I wondered what had happened to it.
Yeah, we are going to cover that in the presentation at the end of the session, if that's all right. Can we hold it until then? Sorry.
Okay. Any others? If not, can we move on to the minutes from the subcommittees? First of all, the bus network. In Mark's absence, can I ask Philip, who was in attendance, to move those minutes?
Move them, Chair.
Thank you. Those agreed? Any matters or questions? No, thank you. That takes us on to the capital projects. Guy?
Yeah, could I move it? And I think Eunice has got a couple of amendments to make to the minutes. Slight amendments.
West Orton on page 2122 on bullet point 4. West Orton spelt wrong. And further down on the first one about interchange programme update, the first bullet point on that one says multiple learning disabilities. It's multiple disabilities, not multiple learning disabilities.
Okay, with those amendments, we have
The actual spelling of West Horton is C-O-W-Y-E-A-D.
that's a private joke for those from that neck of the woods. Okay. Can we agree those minutes? And if there are no other matters, move on to item 6, which is the register of key decisions. Has anyone got any questions on any of those?
Rail.
Sorry, Metrolink and Rail. Metrolink and Rail, Doreen?
Move them, Chairman.
Anything arising out of those? No. Thank you very much. 6, the register of key decisions. Any questions on those? We agree to note those. Thank you. There are no items for further approved law resolution by the committee. So that takes us on to the year-end review presentation. This is a version for us of a presentation that I think was prepared for staff within Transport for Greater Manchester. Do you want to say anything by way of introduction, Bob?
No, it's fine.
Good. I think it's come to the end. There's no surprise.
That's the end.
Addition is the no. Okay, so well, thanks very much for that. Has anyone got any comments or questions on that? No. If not, can we move on to item 8 then, the cycling and walking strategy presentation. I think Chris is going to introduce this. Where's Chris? Oh, there he is, right at the end. Okay.
Right, I'll say I like to wander, but still. So this was presented to the Combined Authority in December, and it was received and accepted and endorsed. I'm just going to rattle through the main points of the report. So the goal is to double and then double again cycling. This is a goal that we've had since the Velo City Cycle City Ambition Grant first round, so that by 2025 we're aiming to reach 10% of journeys by cycle. And we're also aiming to make walking a real option for most short journeys. The 15 steps are in the front of your thing. We'll just go through them in a bit more detail. So we are committed to producing, in conjunction with officers at TFGM obviously and in the districts, cycling and walking plans for each district and combined together to make sense of a network for Greater Manchester, and that will be published later this year. We have pitched for a ring-fenced 1.5 billion budget after a kick-starting period over the next couple of years, and we are perceiving that as being part of the Greater Manchester Transport Fund 2 to a large extent, so that we're building total highways, total infrastructure, and not just adding on cycle infrastructure. After the first period of finishing schemes off, perhaps doing some temporary experimental schemes and so on, we want to be completely integrated with other infrastructure investments. We're going to produce a highway design guide, and we're going to join a global mayors network supporting a particular design guide called the Global Street Design Guide. And that has to be Andy that joins that. We're suggesting that districts should test designs with temporary traffic orders and experimental works, which has been done successfully in other cities in the UK, for example, in Leicester and Nottingham, but also around the world. New York City used this very successfully indeed to get through controversial schemes, then became incredibly popular. And instead of people pushing back when new schemes were announced, they started ringing the Mayor's office and the Transportation Commissioner and asking, when are we going to get our cycle lanes? Such was the effect on profit of retailers, the feel of the city, the amount of public space in the city that could be used by walkers and cyclists. We wish to see walking and cycling integrated in all townscape schemes and transport schemes. We want to see health savings recognised in funding, and we've had meetings with Greater Manchester Health and Social Care about that, and they're willing in principle. They don't really want to be seen investing in curbs and tarmac, but they are willing to invest in the results of increasing activity and making the city healthier, including by reducing congestion and improving air quality. We would like to see better last mile deliveries for freight and logistics for the city centre and the other town centres and urban centres, so that we get less conflict with HGVs and vans. And that's a piece of work that's been going on within TFGM for a couple of years now, which we see as very important. We think there's a clear opportunity to boost cycling and walking to schools, and once people are used to walking and cycling, then they will continue that hopefully throughout their lives. And you know, instead of saying, I don't walk to school because of the traffic, people will recognise that they in fact are the traffic, and if they stop driving themselves, then there'll be less traffic. We have quite a good record in Greater Manchester in terms of fatal and serious injuries on the roads, but there is an opportunity to bear down on that. We're still 50 people a year are still killed on our roads in Greater Manchester, and we are establishing a road safety task force with the police, TFGM and others. We are asking government for devolution of powers on roads and traffic, so things like enforcement, pavement parking, all those things that currently are in grey areas between the police and local authorities, or that are difficult to enforce. We want to see highways authorities measuring people through junctions and along roads instead of measuring passenger car units, and we want to see residents rating their streets so that we can see what progress we're making. And we want to involve and support local people throughout this process. 13 is about public bikes. It's particularly about the bike share schemes such as Mobike. I think there will be other alternative schemes in the near future as well. We'd like to see this spreading to all the districts, but it's also about schemes like the apprentice, the bike, refurbished bikes and so on as well. We want to work with businesses, and I know that's something, a report we had at the last meeting about modal shift and travel choices and the work of the travel choices team at TFGM. And we would like to use special events, which in New York they call summer streets, to trial closures of streets for just the odd Sunday here and there in the summer, giving people a flavour of what it's like, people realising that the sky doesn't fall on their heads if you close a few streets in your town centre or city centre, perhaps therefore making the case for some more permanent changes along those lines. This quote comes from Portland in America. Riding a bike or crossing a street should not require bravery. They identified there was loads of different types of cyclists. There was ones that were completely brave, would cycle whatever the conditions. Quite a lot, maybe 8%, that would cycle if it was a bit safer. So you're getting then towards 10% with those two groups. And then there was a huge group of about 60% that would cycle only if it was much safer than it currently is. And that reflects the same sort of results and attitudes that we've seen in the Bike Life report. And there's some copies available of that as well. We would have 20% cycling if we had the same propensity to cycle as they do in Holland, in Greater Manchester. Imagine if all those journeys were taken off the roads, there'd be so much less congestion, there'd be so much cleaner air, and everyone would be much healthier and happier. So that is the kind of a longer term aspiration. Once we hit the 10%, we start shooting for 20%. Public hire bike schemes, quite successful, not entirely without some wrinkles and difficulties, but hopefully it will settle in and it becomes a real part of the way people get around in Manchester, especially the last mile. Maybe make people think, well, I can leave the car at home, I can jump on a hire bike to the station or the stop, and then I can ride on a train or a tram or a bus, and then I can also take a short journey at the other end on a hire bike. And we've found nationally that up to 15% of people who come back to cycling via public bike share schemes then make a decision to purchase a bike and start cycling more regularly. So it's like a gateway towards more regular cycling as well. We're very keen on districts trying things out and making the case with an actual active research rather than just having to go through what's a very difficult process of changing something permanently. There's a lot of fear and concern about that. If you test something out for 6 months and take it out if it doesn't work, then I think you've got an easier way of getting things done sometimes. I'm not saying that should be the rule all along, but we certainly recommend it as an approach that can be tried. This little map shows the sort of propensity or the opportunities around all the districts to increase cycling. So it's a combination of where there already is quite a lot of cycling and where the environment and the terrain is favourable, which applies to quite a lot of the south of Manchester that already are quite high levels of cycling. So there's an area, a census area within Whalley Range, Chorlton Borders, that's got 16% of people who declare cycling as their main means of travel to work. Whereas there are other parts around the north and the east of the conurbation where there is literally nobody at all in some of those census districts says that they cycle to work at the moment. So the sort of fried eggs indicate where there's a lot of short journeys being taken in cars at the moment. So opportunity to transfer those into cycling and walking. And the big red blobs show where there's already quite a heavy amount of cycling, so which we can encourage. I think we're aware that cities that have provided a network in short order, very quickly, to the whole city have seen very, very big improvements in cycle share, and that includes doing areas that you wouldn't think were that promising. So Seville's an example of that. They delivered 100 kilometres of cycleways within a couple of years, and they increased from less than 0.5% of people to more than 7%. So that's a 15-fold increase over just a very short period by providing a coherent network so you can go anywhere within Seville by bike. Proportion of children that cycle to school in this country is only 3%. Now, there are schools in Greater Manchester where it's 50% and 20%, but on average it's only 3%. In the Netherlands it's 50%. So again, this is getting people into a habit, healthy means of getting to school and reducing traffic, and that's a sort of aspiration that we've got, to try and get in early years to get people cycling and walking more. This is an indication, and all these figures are supported with references and evidence of some of the costs per year of not doing this. The way we move at the moment is costing us, Greater Manchester, 1.3 billion per year in congestion. So the costs on businesses, the stress. Air quality is reckoned to be 1.1 billion in terms of health, very poor health outcomes. Casualties that I've mentioned, including unreported ones, which are maybe 2/3 of all serious injuries, add up to nearly £1 billion. And there are smaller elements as well for other costs of road use. Altogether, 3.75 billion per year. So, you know, indicating that spending 50 or 100 million a year is really very small compared to the potential gains from doing this. And government figures show that cycling infrastructure is one of the best paybacks of all types of investment, with at least £5.50 per pound spent. So next steps, that's a little hard to read. So the Mayor received a large Transforming Cities budget from the government in the autumn, early winter, and he has decided to spend a high proportion of that on this agenda, cycling and walking. So we need to see all that in writing, but hopefully we will have a substantial amount of money to get this process started over the next 4 years. We are looking at imagining what sort of network we could have. You know, if all things being equal, if everything was easy, what would be the ideal network we would like? And then we're asking districts to come forward with practical schemes that they can deliver, and creating a pipeline of schemes that can be delivered over the next 3 to 4 years. And then we are obviously looking to secure longer term funding for this to continue for the next decade. On the left you see St Peter's Square. That's a kind of environment, and many of you have got these in your own district centres and town centres, where pedestrians and people on cycles and passenger transport are the dominant factors, and there is very, very little motorised traffic in that area. And this is sort of consistent with the hierarchy of road users that almost all of us have in our districts, and that's common throughout this country, where people on foot and cycling and who are wheeling in wheelchairs are at the top, and people in cars are really at the bottom. You wouldn't really think that if you landed in most of our cities at the moment, in most parts of Greater Manchester, but that's the hierarchy which in theory we're trying to work to, and we would like to make that a reality. Different version of the same thing. And here you go, that's what 200 people looks like in 177 cars. And if it works, it's not going to work, is it? It would show you what they would look like in other modes, and it becomes about 1/10 of that if those people are on cycles. Apologies that hasn't worked. So happy to take any questions or comments. I'd like to thank the TFGM teams, Cross Cycling and all the others, the Urban Traffic Control and the Travel Choices and so on, for all the help and assistance they've been providing. trying to work in a joined-up way. Still not quite clear the lines of reporting. Chris reports direct to the Mayor, but obviously has a very close working relationship with colleagues at Transport for Greater Manchester as well.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. So has anyone got any questions? Yes. Azra.
Chris, this is a great plan and it's a very bold vision for Greater Manchester, just what I think we need. You're proposing 1.5 billion infrastructure fund to be invested over the next 10 years. How did you arrive at that figure? And where are we looking to get that amount of money? That's one. And the other one is, with this 1.5 billion, what targets have you set for more people walking and cycling over this period? As we're all aware, to get that, it all needs behaviour change. How much of this 1.5 billion will be for capital and how much for revenues in order to achieve this?
Okay, quite hard questions there. Yeah, start with the easy question. Yeah. In terms of generating the figure, the 1.5 billion, we looked at the cost of doing things. So we know that we've got about 700 miles of major roads and transport corridors, which in theory, most of them we'd like to see suitable for people to walk and cycle along. Although some of them are mainly links and some of them have got lots of places along them as well. So we're recognising, along with the strategy and policy colleagues at TFGM, that there is a difference between roads that are mainly links and roads that are places in town centres and so on. We know that to do a road at different standards has different costs. So, for example, the roads that Roger's done in Great Clew Street and Blackfriars Road, it cost about £500,000 per mile to do that. If it had been already really good tarmac condition, it would have cost about £50,000 a mile to do that. But if you do a scheme like Oxford Road, Wilmslow Road, it's more like £2 to £3 million per mile. So we have a mixture of those different types of schemes in mind. We also know how much it costs to do a greenway. So, for example, a disused railway or a canal, it's perhaps £100,000 a mile, perhaps a bit more, depending on the conditions. So we added those up and said, if we do this amount to create a network along the key routes, if we provide some leisure routes and parallel routes on greenways, if we civilise some of our town centres and make them more hospitable to people walking and cycling in the way they've done in London under a scheme called Mini Hollands, it will cost this amount of money. We've also looked at what they've spent in London, and they've been spending over the last 10 years about 100 million a year on purely on cycling, but also quite large sums on improving junctions. So they picked out the 30 worst junctions and they've spent on average £10 million per junction on those. They've done lots of work on public realm and walking. So the £1 billion every 10 years they're spending in London, which is roughly the same geography in terms of the space, the amount of space. They've got roughly the same number of miles of major highways, despite having 9 million people, and we're only on 2.8 million. The geography is almost the same size, and we've got almost the same amount of roads. We've used comparators like that, also Oslo and Seville, and that's how we've come up with the figure. How we're going to achieve it, I've worked with colleagues in both GMCA and TFGM to look at all the various possible sources of funding for this. I think there's 90 lines in the spreadsheet of possible places that money could be contributed from, some more likely than others. But we will work, as I said in the presentation, as part, after this interim, the initial period, we hope to work very much with the Greater Manchester Transport Fund to be very much integrated within that. We also hope that districts will come forward, and we know that some districts have got money from other places. So we saw some schemes from Salford earlier this week at the Cycle Reference Group at TFGM, which had been funded in different ways, and that obviously is match funding that will go towards the overall total we're looking at.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean the target is 10% cycling and much more walking than we've got currently. And it's not that far-fetched. You know, places where we provided infrastructure, like Oxford Road, Welmsley Road, we've seen massive increases in the amount of cycling.
Okay, I take Peter, and then there are some down this side of the room.
Thanks, Chris. It's a really good report, that. I know from fact that when we've done work in Tameside and removing roundabouts and putting junctions in, being able to put in safe crossings and cycleways has been a boon. Getting people to cycle down to the railway station and hopping on loads of public transport is a fantastic idea, but when you've got stations that have got no security and nowhere to store a bike, is there any money in the pot to put secure bike sheds?
We have been investing, as you know, in cycle hubs, including a couple of very high standard ones at Media City and at Piccadilly City Tower, and also a number of transport interchanges around Greater Manchester. I think there's about 15 of the smaller type ones now. That process is being reviewed in terms of how effective it's been, what the take-up has been, what the issues are with improving the use of those hubs that we've already got. And I'm sure that that will form part of the mix. You know, every single cycle journey starts with a parked bike and it finishes with a parked bike. So you need to provide facilities for people to park bikes and store bikes, including at their homes. I mean, we've got a lot of terraced housing in Greater Manchester where the space is at a premium, and some of the London boroughs have done schemes with bike hangers in the streets, which mean that people that aren't restricted from cycling because they haven't got large drives or garages or hallways in their houses. So we have to look at storing and parking bikes as part of the mix.
Thanks, Chair. I think this is culmination time, really, of just getting this agenda in front of us, really, because it's taken a long time to take this seriously. And I still think there's a long way to go. I think it's really good on cycling. It's not so, there's not enough in there, to be honest, on walking. It talks about big routes, and in many ways in our town centres, but it doesn't talk about how people are going to walk to our town centres. There's no point in providing a beautiful public realm in your local town if the only way to get to that town is via a car that goes over multiple roundabouts and no way through. Often, and I know this isn't just Trafford, it's everywhere really. Often walking the short route is really difficult, particularly for old people. We talk about keeping the traffic flowing, but we never talk about keeping people moving. So they'll often have to wait really long times at controlled crossings for them to do. And when you talk to traffic managers, they say, oh, well, I've got to keep the traffic moving. What about people? They've got to keep moving as well. Why do they have... And there's evidence to suggest, particularly amongst old people, it feels more dangerous the longer you wait at a crossing. There's studies in terms of the website I would go to is the Institute of Urban Design, and they've done some really good stuff on older people and what prevents them from walking, what park cars on pavements and things like this. And I think it's one of those areas where we're spending a lot of money on social isolation or things like that, and people are no longer meeting. And I think there's a really big thing in Greater Manchester where we actually start thinking, is this a mapped out route that we really need, or do we need to really just deal with the corner of our street? And often it's the corner of our street that's more important than this super highway for pedestrians and everybody to turn in a country walk. And I think we're missing that. And sometimes it feels to me amongst our districts that we point to, I don't know, in Trafford it's Sale Water Park, in Salford it might be the, what's that loop called that links Monte? Yeah, so we've done some things on walking, but actually our own street network is really not pedestrian friendly. And I think that's something that we really need to think about. So I really welcome the report, particularly on the cycling element. I welcome what the opening paragraph, I forget what it is, I haven't brought my, I haven't got access to my laptop, but the making walking the first choice for short journeys is really what it's about. And I don't think that is huge, great, mapped out networks of walking routes. I do think it's very, very local.
Yeah, I think we're very aware of the need to bring the walking forward. And Chris Boardman obviously has a history as an athlete. 25 years ago, last June, was it? He got the Olympic medal that sort of started the culture of sports cycling in the UK back after a very, very long 70 years, I think, without similar success. And he is very closely identified with cycling, but we are very aware of this. And so Martin Key, who's here, who works for British Cycling, is seconded to the team, previously worked for Ramblers. We have Jenny Wiles, who is the Northern Director of Living Streets, a charity that works with place and walking and public realm, also seconded from them. And we are very aware of the need to bring forward walking. If you think about a scheme like Oxford Road, that was primarily a bus scheme, actually, it has got major benefits for cycling, which are very visible, but also for pedestrians and walking. And I think every scheme we do that's ostensibly a cycling scheme also has benefits for people who are on foot, and it also quite often has benefits for people who are in cars, people on buses and so on. And we need to be making the case, if we're going to get people out of cars, if we're going to avoid the kind of very big scale public pushback, we need to be showing that this is for everyone and it's going to benefit everyone. And there are ways of doing that. We're certainly going to be investing in walking, and we know the districts will want to do this. Pretty much, if you look around Greater Manchester, every district has got £1 billion or £500 million town centre renewal programme on the blocks looking for funding, and those schemes are all going to involve much better walking facilities within those town centres. So we will certainly be backing that to the hilt.
Thank you. Robin.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, congratulations to Chris on the report. It's a brilliant report. I think it's we're clearly moving in the right direction. In fact, I can say, in fact, that after 50 odd years, I've actually just purchased a bicycle. Not a terribly expensive one, I have to say, but it does mean I can go out with the grandchildren now, so it's quite a good incentive. Absolutely, yeah, okay. But no, seriously, I think one of the problems, and I think Chris referred to it in his answer to Councillor Ali, and that was the level of expenditure on different types of cycle lanes. And I just wonder, in fact, whether we are, instead of doing a more thorough job, right, on a smaller number of schemes, whether we're trying to spread ourselves too far. And I mean, looking at the picture, in fact, on the Amsterdam picture, where you've got a curb that actually separates the cycle lane from the road, which to my way of thinking makes it safer. It gives a much more distinct separation between the traffic and the cycles, whether we shouldn't actually spend a bit more on getting the ones that we've got up to a really good standard and a much safer standard before we actually go too far with those that don't provide the same level of safety. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it just seems to me that you know, we need to really encourage people that are using those that we've got to use them more, and I think we'll do that by making them safer. You know, and let's encourage each local authority. And I think that's all I have to say. Yeah, and I'm sure Roger will back me up here. We've certainly gone out on a bit of a limb, and I'm gone out to get additional money to do cycle-friendly schemes. And I think each local authority's got to be encouraged to do that, and not just expect the money to come from a central source such as TFGM. So I think each local authority needs to be encouraged to do that. In terms of walking, totally agree. I mean, in Salford now, we've got virtually a circular route on the linear walkway on the loop line, which was the old railway line. That's been greened. In fact, part of it actually now has the guided busway on it. But nevertheless, it's used very frequently by lots of people. And I think if we can provide that sort of facility in other areas, then it's certainly moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I thank you, Robin, for your support, and I think thank you to all the members of this committee. I think when we first started trying to bring this forward a few years ago, there was less support, but it's notable that when we discuss cycling and walking these days, that many members of the committee want to make points and support what's going on, and that's very welcome and very useful to know that we've got that support from all the districts. I think Robin's right that very safe, separated infrastructure for cycling and indeed for walking is the kind of gold standard, and that's what we would like to see. But I think there will be some cases where roads that travel a bit slower, where the traffic's slower, there's plenty of space, there will be opportunities to do less completely separated cycling, quiet ways, greenways and so on, which have been tried and used in other cities, including in the continent, in great cycling nations. But we will have a mixture, I think, and I think we do want to do quality, but there's also an incentive to try and have a good network. So if some of that's done in more temporary ways and then upgraded over time. So for example, New York City's got about 1,000 miles of cycleways, but only 100 miles or so is actually separated. But they've created the space that they can then go back to, put the curbs in later, and that's a useful process, and it will be part of this, I feel. But we are going to be insisting that where there's investment from the mayor, and hopefully from TFGM sources as well, that the standards are very high, so that the infrastructure is suitable for say a competent 12-year-old, which is a sort of every man, every woman figure that represents older people, people that are less confident as well, and every footway to be suitable for someone with a double buggy to get around in as well. That's the kind of easy way of describing the standards that we are hoping to get from all districts as we go through this.
Good, thank you. Now, was there anyone else coming down this side? Rob, yes.
Thank you, Chairman. I would concur with what Councillor Cordingley said about walking. This is an area that does need to be addressed quite urgently, and I think we run the risk, not that it's a risk because it's a great thing, but of cycling kind of edging the cycling agenda, edging the walking agenda, which is extremely important. Far too many of our developments in the past 40 or 50 years have been designed for cars across the conurbation, with pedestrians as more of an afterthought, and hopefully we can get over that in new developments, and we also really need to address situations where that has caused a problem. And I would just perhaps mention has been made of cycle hubs. I would give them a bit of a shout out, to be honest. I've been disappointed really by the slight lack of take up in some of them. And I really do think, there's been a few technical issues, but they're a fantastic idea, and I do think they need to be promoted and pushed as far as possible, and maybe even expanded, because what puts an awful lot of people off cycling to certain places and around the conurbation, wherever they happen to be going, is that there is nowhere safe to leave your bicycle. And too many people have had, including myself, have had bikes nicked. And you want somewhere that's behind closed doors that you can put your bike and you don't have to worry about it. So I really would hope that TFGM would continue to push these hubs so that we can expand them and get them working and get them more popular. And finally, just a note, the report's excellent, and I would hope that in future reports I know that Wigan colleagues, Councillor Whiteside, my colleague on the Bridgewater Canal Trust, would be jumping up and down to make sure that the canal gets and the Bridgewater Way gets as much of a mention as possible. It is a very, I mean, appreciate it only covers 4 of the 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester, but it's a wonderful asset to us. It's for connectivity for cycling and walking, and I do hope it will get as much of a mention in maps and in reports as possible. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. I think the point about parking and storage of bikes is well made, and we are aware of this. We do need to make sure we make investments that people will take up and use, and there's a sort of patchy, mixed experience with the hubs that we've got so far. We need to delve down a bit, find out why that is, and make wise investments in future that will be taken up, and try and drive the use of the existing facilities that we've got. Completely take the point about walking. We do, highways engineers and their political masters do tend to measure the highways network in terms of passenger car units, it's called. So a passenger car counts as 1 unit, a bus counts as 2, maybe 3 if it's a articulated bus, a lorry similar. Bicycle, person on a bike counts as 0.2, someone on foot counts as 0. So while we're measuring junctions like that, they are going to be mainly suitable for passenger cars to go through. And they're not even recognising the people on the bus. That's maybe 90 people. They're counting those as if they're 2 cars. So we need to get away from that a bit, while recognising that for economic growth, we still need to keep cars moving for the people that for whom they are essential. We need to keep light vans and HGVs moving where those are essential. But we need to start measuring junctions in terms of how many people we can get through them. You know, the passenger car unit is seen by some cyclists as quite a valuable thing, because it suggests, given the speed of traffic and the volume of traffic on any given highway, what sort of facilities should be provided. And most of our arterial routes that unit would suggest need separated cycling. And so, while it's a difficulty around junctions, measuring them in terms of car units, in terms of roads, it does actually dictate that they really ought to have separated facilities for cyclists. So it's a bit swings and roundabouts.
Okay, I think, was it Noel? Oh, no.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a quick one, really. Thanks for the presentation, Chris, and the booklet, which is excellent. As somebody who spends a lot of time walking around both the city centre and around my locality where I live, the biggest problem I find or encounter is vehicles as obstacles, which, and Chris has touched upon the double buggy rule of thumb, but also the built environment. So I wonder how much of this money is going to contribute to the built environment in terms of broken flagstones. There's been a rush in recent years for people to get bigger and bigger vehicles, unnecessarily, in my opinion, in many cases, but that's not the point. People are buying larger vehicles, and everywhere you go, you can walk in any direction out of this building, you will find broken flagstones, which are expensive to replace. And the council, and this council, other councils throughout the country, but particularly in the north, just don't have the money to replace broken paving, broken flagstones, etc. And that is detrimental to people actually wanting to walk around. The parked vehicles, which in London, as some of you will know, there is legislation, and pavement parking is effectively outlawed across London. We don't have that here, but so there's that can be resolved by legislation, possibly, but also the issue of fixing the damaged flagstones, which is a major problem in my opinion. Thank you.
Funnily enough, Councillor Richard Lee said something similar at the Combined Authority meeting about, just the condition of the highways and the footways being a major issue, and if that was improved, that would enhance the walking and cycling experience and stop people being trapped in their homes, for example, if they're old and find it hard to get around on broken, busted footways. So we are very much aware of this, but the scope of the investment that we're proposing doesn't include holding every district's hand and dealing with every issue of annual maintenance programmes. It couldn't possibly. You'd probably need another £1 billion for that. Manchester alone it has got a fund of 100 million which they're spending over 5 years, which will probably address about half the need, if that, to restore carriageways and footways to a decent standard without improving them or remodelling them in any way. So I think that's another, it's very, very important that we have reliable surfaces for cars, for bikes, for people on foot and in wheelchairs, but it's not within the scope of this work. But we will certainly be encouraging everything that goes in to be of a very good standard, indeed.
Chris was next.
You know, Chris Boardman's got a mantra of 3 things, really. He says to get people out of cars, whether it's walking or cycling, it needs to be easy, it needs to be attractive, and it needs to be safe. And he repeats this over and over again. He gave evidence to the London Assembly Transport Committee earlier this week. There's a video available of that, and this is the point he's making. If he's going to get people out of cars, and those are the target of this. It's not cyclists, and it's not ramblers that are the target of this. It's people that are currently in cars that are the target. To get those people to walk and cycle, you need to make it easy, attractive, and safe, and that's what we're going to be aiming for.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. It was really interesting. This morning I took my daughter on my way to the meeting. It's about a 1.5 mile walk, so we're talking about those short journeys. And just as a matter of interest to me, while we're talking about wanting to promote walking, in part of my portfolio, I've recently had to sit there and kind of sign off where we've been as a local authority, reducing the number of pedestrian crossings that we have for children at school crossings. So there's this sort of almost like a conflict there in the times that we're at with this austerity, and we're having to make some really tough choices. Some of those crossings are where they've been they are pedestrianised, but it just is that whole like linking up stuff. So I'm just wondering how does one talk to the other in terms of that broader thing? And then just as a further point, we've had some significant investment in Ratcliffe in our new cycleway to make it safe for people crossing the road there, linking the Oval Sculpture Trail. And I'm just wondering how we'll be able to monitor and how that is going to be measured in terms of impact going forward.
Okay. I think the work around schools, I think if we're driving people to walk and cycle to school, we need to make it safe to do that. And that it is a question for the 10 highways authorities to deal with. In Manchester, they're reducing the number of school crossing patrols as well, but they're doing it by substituting capital expenditure on improved crossings, controlled crossings, to make it the route to school safe without the intervention of lollipop man or woman. Radcliffe is interesting. Went up there, as you know, to launch some of the work before, I think it was in October, and cycled back down along the Greenway from Radcliffe that comes out in Salford near the Irwell. And this was an investment that was made with Cycle City Ambition Grant a few years ago, but it was one that isn't really paying off in the way it should do, because that cycleway hasn't been maintained at all. So it's full of mud and water and leaves. And we know, myself and the officer that cycled down with me, know that underneath that mud and leaves there is a 3 or 4 metre wide tarmac path all the way from Radcliffe to Kersal, which is a great route. It doesn't have any lighting, so it's not necessarily a great route at night or in winter. But we need to also factor in how we're going to maintain these provisions, make sure that we don't build things that then are not looked after properly. The same goes for ice and leaf clearance in urban contexts as well. Districts and other investors need to be sure that they've got a suitable maintenance programme, as well as just getting the curbs and tarmac down that we need.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is the most marvellous report. Thank you very much. There must have been an awful lot of work that's gone into it, so I think it's fantastic to inform us all. I just missed a piece of information you gave about the cost of the repairs to the footways. Did you say £500 million? What you referred to this? You know, the cracked pavements. You gave a figure. Going back, a couple of questions.
Yeah, I gave a figure for Manchester's investment. So Manchester borrowed £100 million to spend over 5 years to try and renew the main parts of our highways network in Manchester. I think Stockport have got a similar programme, and others. It's a pattern that's been used around the country. Borrow money, pay it down over a couple of decades rather than straight away. So the figure was 100 million in Manchester, and similar figures in other districts. I just speculated that you'd need another £1 billion really probably to deal with all of that, and the remit and the scope of this work is not to deal with that annual maintenance issue.
So you're thinking the £1 billion to fix all the pavements over what area? Just Manchester?
No, that's a very rough guess of what it would need to get Greater Manchester's roads and footways up to spec, but it's outside the scope of this work, so it's quite a wild guess, but it's probably around the right quantum.
Yeah, well, I obviously agree with everybody. I think it's a great report, and I think, Chris, I think your team, 10 years ago, you couldn't have done this report, or if you had tried to, I don't think it would have been given the priority, but one way or the other, you've managed to force cycling and walking right to the top of the agenda, which I think is a credit for everybody, the way you've done that. The only issue I wanted to mention really was this issue of safety. And I know we can't go back to the 50s now, but where I live, and I'm sure it's the same everywhere else, when you had a cul-de-sac in the old days, you'd be lucky to find one car in it. Now, you can't move for cars. So children have a real problem with playing in the street, let alone cycling, because it's just unsafe because of the traffic movements that we're all used to. I just wondered whether there was any evidence, because I always say to people, parents and grandparents are not going to encourage kids on bikes if they don't think they're safe. That's the biggest worry, the fear that there'll be an accident. I just wondered whether you had any statistics that showed if it wasn't for this fear of safety, how many more children and young people we could get, you know, because you always quote the Netherlands, which, you know, when you go to Amsterdam and places, it's fantastic to see the number of cyclists, and it would be lovely if we can get to those sort of target levels. But I always feel it's safety that's holding a lot of people back.
Yeah, I think that's dead right, Roger. And I think if you look at the Bike Life report that came out in 2015 and the one that's come out in 2017, which is a survey of a broad population, not cyclists, not people that are committed to that mode of transport, just a random sample of members of the public. The attitude is very clear that safety of cycling is a very major obstacle to people taking up cycling. A very large proportion of people would like to cycle more or resume cycling if it was safe. And there's very good statistical backup for our kind of proposals within that Bike Life report, and there are copies here which everyone can take away with them and examine. It's a very good evidence base. As it said in the earlier video come slide presentation of the achievements of transport in GM over the last year, 77% of people asked in that survey said they would like to see major investment in walking and cycling, particularly cycling because it's Bike Life, and they would like to see that even if it meant that their own journeys by private car were slightly extended in time. They thought it was very important to make this safe, despite any kind of personal interest in, you know, perhaps having a slightly longer journey. In fact, that fear isn't necessarily borne out in reality, because as you shift mode from people sitting in cars to being on bikes or walking, it means there's less congestion, and it means that the roads move more smoothly. And also, many cities have found that in remodelling their streets, they have been able to provide more green time and get faster speeds through congested urban areas, whereas everyone thought putting cycle lanes through Times Square and closing Broadway down in New York would have a massively desperate effect on traffic. In fact, there was more green time for cars as a result, because all the junctions became much more simple. Broadway sort of runs at a diagonal and it interrupts all the other gridiron roads. So instead of having 6 legs on every junction, there's 4 legs on every junction, and the car driver's experience is now much better as well as a pedestrian and walking experience. The land values have gone through the roof, retail sales have massively increased, so all the kind of fears of what this sort of intervention might do to a busy commercial district were not borne out at all. And we've now got a situation where a major company like Google are looking for a second headquarters in North America, and the top line of their specification is that the city they go to must have good facilities for walking and for cycling, because they know that the sort of people they want to work for them in IT and marketing and media and so on, very interested in getting about under human power. So it's become a kind of inward investment attraction, as well as all the other benefits of doing it.
Right, we need to make progress, so very, very quickly now, Zidra and then Guy.
Hi, like most of the people, I welcome the presentation. I think it's really good. But what I think at the moment, you have still a lot of work to do to change the behavior, not just of a people like ourselves, but also the council officers and highway authorities, because I represent 11 June Ward, and when the road is due to be resurfaced or any work done, when we request something, the answer is always, oh no, it's not possible. I think the attitude should be, how can we make it happen? Which scheme? There are so many schemes, and to see which one of them would be actually possible to achieve to improve that facilities, instead of investing so much money resurfacing the road and not looking into how we can actually improve and reduce the amount of cars. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this has been found in London as well as we're finding, that there are some issues. You need to have the will and the space to be able to do something. You need to have the capacity in terms of design, engineers and so on that can develop good schemes. And you also need to have the political support. So you need all those 3 things, really. And I think a new colleague, I'm not sure it's official, but somebody that's been working for TfL, who hopefully is going to come and join the wider team on this, said that only 5 of the London boroughs have got those 3 boxes ticked, and that's why it's been quite difficult for London mayors to get through things in the boroughs, and why they've concentrated on what's called the mayor's roads, the key route network, because most of the boroughs don't have the capacity and don't have the enthusiasm for doing it. In Greater Manchester, we found the first part of our process was to go and visit all the leaders of the 10 districts, have personal meetings with them. Chris Boardman obviously opens every door that he tries to get through. People open it for him, and that makes it a lot easier. As you know, this is not my report. Having Chris Boardman on board has been a fantastic boon to get moving this forward. I think the vision of the mayor's manifesto promises, which were kind of crowdsourced, so there was a big process to develop his manifesto, and one of the things he said he would do was to appoint a walking and cycling commissioner. He did it incredibly quickly, so by July, after being elected in May, he had made an appointment. We encouraged Chris Boardman to do it. There was a lot of a process going on behind the scenes as well, and Chris is a real pleasure to work with, as Martin and Jenny would attest as well. It's been a great piece of teamwork, and working with the officers at TFGM has also been very fruitful. We found that we've got the same kind of general thoughts about how this needs to be done, what the things are to get people out of cars and onto bikes and on foot. We've got a very much a common view about how that's to be done. And it's been a great pleasure to be able to move this forward so much in the last 6 months. After, you know, as people have recognised, we have been moving this forward over the last 5 years, but in the last 5 or 6 months, things have really started to motor, if that's the wrong thing to say.
Right, on that note, I'll just ask Guy if he'd like to have the last word.
Well, just 1 or 2 things. First of all, as everyone has said, excellent pieces of work. Particularly, I like learning from other cities, not reinventing the wheel, going around the world and seeing what works, so that when we introduce things, we've got evidence that these things have worked elsewhere, and that's very, very, very good, I think. When you talked about priority for cycling, I was reminded of the Phil Coulter lyric, "What's done is done, what's won is won, what's lost is lost and gone forever." So what I'd like to see is a priority to reallocating road space, even if we can't do anything with it immediately to our satisfaction. So in other words, planning well ahead to say that we got it wrong historically and that we need to reallocate road space, even if it's sort of almost like land banking for the future, so that we reallocate the space, and then later on, as you said earlier, you can have a lane that later on you physically separate. But let's do the reallocate. Let's give a high priority to saying for too long motorists have had too much of the available space, and people on two wheels and people who are walking haven't had enough of that space. So that I'd just like to make that as a strategic priority, reallocation, and then follow it up with the physical things that need to be done. That's one point. Second point, when you said about the mantra of easy, attractive and safe, I've noticed as a layperson that power-assisted bikes seem to be moving up the commercial agenda. Is it worth doing some dedicated looking at that to encourage people who are perhaps instinctively less mobile than some of the rest of us to actually say, is there a cohort of people that we could target who would be amenable to moving over to two wheels in that mode rather than in a traditional cycling mode? This is when you said, you remember the old slogan you had a couple of years ago, "I am not a cyclist." You know, there are a cohort of people, maybe middle-aged, people not quite as fit as others, who you could target and say, look, it is easy. This assists you. I don't know. I mean, it's just a thought because, as I say, as a layperson, I'm noticing commercially these power-assisted vehicles seem to be going up the agenda, and should we be incorporating that in part of our strategy?
Well, I think two main points there. I think I agree if we can establish a network and perhaps protect it with more temporary arrangements and then come back and do curbs later, that would be hitting the spot really, because people need a viable network, not just an A to B along Wilmslow Road and Oxford Road. They want to be able to get from there to wherever else they're trying to get to in the conurbation, not just particular selected cherry-picked routes. So we need as much of a network as possible. I think we can protect that in cheaper ways in the short term and then come back and re-engineer it. The point about e-bikes, TFGM is involved in a project called Triangulum. I think it's part connected to the Internet of Things and City Verve, Manchester Verve, and that involves cargo bikes, in particular electric cargo bikes, being available in the university corridor. Very successful so far, and I think the bike share companies that we're talking to, Mobike, and I think some of the districts are talking to other companies as well, are all proposing to bring electric versions forward as well. And I think that is very valuable because it increases the scope in terms of age and abilities, although many people do use ordinary bikes as mobility aids and find that they can cycle much further and easier than they can walk. I've got several citizens in my ward that do that. But it means that hills become less of a barrier. Distance becomes less of a barrier, and certainly colleagues of mine on the council that have got e-bikes are finding that they are getting out far more, and they are still getting exercise despite the fact they've got a motor to help them along a bit. Yeah, good points.
Right, okay, Chris. Well, thank you ever so much for. Sorry, we have got two more presentations, so I'm going to close this one now. And thank Chris and Martin and everyone else who's contributed towards this and attending today. Fantastic presentation, great work so far, very much in line with what we've been doing in recent years and taking it up to the next level or two or more. So thank you all very much indeed. So we now move on to item 9, which is the exclusion of press and public. We're moving into private session now. So someone like to move that? Okay, that's agreed.